Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a really deep sociological look at a fascinating and honestly pretty misunderstood topic: the United States military acting as a tool for social engineering. Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter to us? Well, if your tax dollars are funding these massive global operations, we need to talk about the profound friction that happens when a tool built literally for combat is tasked with the delicate, nuanced work of nation building. By analyzing the raw reality of the Iraq War and then tracing the strategic evolution all the way to U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM, we're going to uncover the very real human and systemic limitations of using armed force to try and construct stable societies.
But to truly understand this, we've got to step way outside the textbooks. Lay the fuck down, it's 2 in the morning. That is the harrowing, visceral reality of a night raid in Iraq, carried out by Charlie Company. You see, when we talk about American foreign policy in an academic setting, we love using these high-minded, sanitized terms like promoting liberal democracy or building relationships. But this quote, it violently juxtaposes those theories with the messy, chaotic reality of rooting out resistance. Every single night, Iraqi families were coming face-to-face with overwhelming American force, and it created this immediate, deep-seated alienation.
And there's a massive, glaring gap between the architects of this foreign policy and the actual execution on the ground. Policy is orchestrated by high-level actors, right? The president as commander-in-chief, Congress holding the purse strings, the State Department, various bureaucratic agencies. They're sitting in clean rooms, looking at global maps, making decisions based on broad, sweeping doctrines like containment or promoting global capitalism. Yet the people making these grand strategic decisions are almost entirely detached from the raw, ground-level consequences of a 2 a.m. raid in a foreign neighborhood.
To really grasp the scale of these decisions, just consider this staggering number: 761. That is the estimated number of U.S. military bases worldwide, from massive, sprawling installations down to smaller, lily-pad outposts. It establishes a state of permanent mobilization. The American foreign policy footprint essentially turns global diplomacy into a distinctly militarized endeavor, where armed forces are stationed all over the globe, ready at a moment's notice for humanitarian aid, open war, or future control.
So, let's zoom in from that macro-level policy and look at part 1, the reality on the ground.
We really have to look closely at what happens when that massive global military footprint actually lands in a place like Samarra, Iraq. During the occupation, soldiers were tasked with dismantling terrorist cells, but because they lacked deep, reliable intelligence, they ended up relying heavily on local informants wearing balaclavas. In one specific instance, soldiers arrested completely innocent men, literally just cousins of a suspect, simply to hold them as leverage. One soldier actually explained the strategy by saying it was, quote, similar to what police do back in the States. Now, the flawed logic here is pretty striking. Treating a foreign military occupation, complete with heavy weaponry and massive language barriers, like local domestic policing, completely ignores the profound cultural and social dynamics at play. Ultimately, they were terrifying the local populace instead of winning them over.
And that disconnect gets even sharper when we look at the stated mission itself. Officially, the mission for Charlie Company sounded great: making Highway 1 safe. That was the sanitized objective. But the reality on the ground? It was a daily nightmare of roadside booby-trap bombs. At one point, a captain literally had to pick up a live explosive just to move it to safety. The constant looming threat of incoming RPGs within 120 seconds of parking meant these soldiers were constantly on edge, fighting a faceless enemy. And all of that just deepened their isolation from the very people they were supposedly there to help.
This friction absolutely reached a boiling point over cultural misunderstandings. Take this quote from Captain Fitzy talking about locals firing weapons in the air during a meeting. He said, "I see an Iraqi with a weapon outside and I just shoot him. There's no such thing as celebratory fire." That right there perfectly encapsulates this profound cultural friction. In an active war zone, an American soldier simply cannot afford to try and distinguish between a cultural celebration and a deadly insurgent attack. But that fundamental inability to safely interpret local customs, it directly results in the destruction of local social cohesion.
Which brings us to our second point: the overarching social engineering failure. We need to make a critical pivot here, because what we're witnessing isn't just a series of unfortunate tactical errors, it is a systemic failure of social engineering. We have to ask this fundamental question: can a combatant be a governor?
Can the exact same person whose job is literally to find the bad guys and kill them also effectively manage a delicate meeting with a newly recruited, grieving local police force? It's an impossible situation forced upon these soldiers. They're trained strictly for violence and survival, yet suddenly deployed as impromptu diplomats and civic leaders.
This impossible situation builds a vivid picture of what sociologists call role strain. Now, role strain happens when a person has serious difficulty meeting the competing responsibilities of a particular role in their life. For soldiers in Iraq, this strain was absolutely crushing. On one hand, they were highly trained to neutralize lethal threats, but simultaneously, they're forced to act as de facto local governors, expected to magically navigate complex cultural and linguistic divides, and tasked with managing local police and municipal disputes. And they had to do all of this while actively dodging mortar fire. The roles of warrior and community builder are in direct, paralyzing conflict.
And it probably won't surprise you that this overlapping pressure takes a severe psychological toll. Private First Class Little shared a really harrowing story about just going to a normal American shopping mall while on leave with his wife. He found himself involuntarily scanning every single exit, checking exactly what every person 50 meters away was holding in their hands. He said, "I seriously felt naked." This totally grounds our academic critique in a very raw human reality. The hypervigilance required just to survive the combat aspects of their deployment makes it neurologically and psychologically agonizing to try and simultaneously operate in a peaceful, civil capacity.
This brings us to the third part of our explainer, the AFRICOM pivot.
Okay, let's dive into this. The U.S. military is at its core a learning organization, and the brutal frictions and massive, heavy footprint of direct occupation in the Middle East led to a major evolution in strategy. If we look across the 53 nations of the African continent, we see the theater for a vastly different tactical approach. U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM, was established to handle a highly complex continent with over 1,000 languages and incredibly diverse multi-ethnic backgrounds, and they deliberately shifted away from that heavy-handed direct occupation model.
You can see a stark evolution in tactics here. Under the Iraq model, the approach was direct occupation and combat. They used massive, heavily fortified bases affectionately called things like the Rock, and security was entirely led by U.S. forces. But the AFRICOM model, it focuses heavily on partner capacity building. So instead of those massive bases, they utilize austere, cooperative security locations. We're talking essentially a few warehouses with tents and water that can be spun up super quickly. And crucially, the security for these installations and the actual combat operations against insurgencies like Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab relies heavily on the host nations themselves. The U.S. is stepping back into a supporting, advising role.
And honestly, perhaps the most telling aspect of this whole shift is that AFRICOM's most touted success wasn't even a combat victory at all. It was a logistical one. During the devastating Ebola crisis in Liberia, AFRICOM supported USAID, not with guns, but with high-speed logistics and engineering. They trained over 1,500 local healthcare workers, and, remarkably, they paid really strict attention to ensuring that local contracts actually matched local economic pay scales. They deliberately avoided the kind of extreme economic disruption that usually accompanies rapid military spending. They took the absolute best core strength of the military, its unmatched speed and coordination, and used it to support a civilian-led health initiative.
Finally, Part 4, the limits of military force.
This strategic pivot gives us a really perfect lens to question the overall limits of military institutions in global diplomacy. The crucial takeaway here is captured perfectly by this realization from AFRICOM Command. They noted, the efforts that we're doing here to get the Africans to solve their problems is the same thing we're trying to do in Afghanistan. It's this overt acknowledgement that you simply cannot permanently impose order from the outside. A professional force in a democracy has to eventually serve its own government and its own people. Long-term stability, whether you're facing down a terrorist network or a biological threat, must eventually come from within the host nation, completely independent of an occupying force. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to take away from our explainer today. We've seen the deeply traumatic friction of forcing soldiers into the role of civic governors. We've seen the military actively adapt to limit its own footprint, shifting toward logistics and advising to avoid the massive pitfalls of direct occupation. So, as we look toward the future of global diplomacy, we really have to ask, can an instrument of war, an apparatus fundamentally built, trained, and equipped for lethal force, ever truly be the successful architect of a stable, long-term democracy?